The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Henderson estate as Grace Williams stepped through the service entrance for the first time. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished surface, a sound that seemed to echo through the vast hallway like a reminder of how out of place she felt in this world of wealth and privilege. At 42, Grace had cleaned houses for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer magnitude of the Henderson mansion. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself, and paintings that looked like they belonged in museums adorned walls covered in silk wallpaper that probably cost more than Grace made in a year. "Mrs. Williams, I presume?" A crisp voice cut through her amazement. Grace turned to see a tall, thin woman with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Her navy blue suit was immaculate, and her expression suggested she had little patience for new employees who might not meet the Henderson family's exacting standards. "Yes, ma'am, Grace Williams." Grace extended her hand, but the woman merely nodded. "I'm Mrs. the head of household staff. You come highly recommended from the family, though I must say your previous employers operated on a considerably smaller scale than what we require here." Mrs.'s eyes swept over Grace's simple black dress and cardigan, taking mental notes that Grace was sure would be and judged. "I understand the work is different here," Grace replied quietly, "but I've always taken pride in doing my job well, no matter how big or small the house." Mrs.'s expression softened slightly, perhaps detecting the genuine sincerity in Grace's voice. "Indeed. Well, let me be clear about your primary responsibilities. You'll be handling the third floor, which includes the family's private quarters. Most importantly, you'll be responsible for Miss Sophie's room and the adjoining therapy space." At the mention of Sophie, Mrs.'s entire demeanor changed. The strict professionalism remained, but there was something else now, a protective concern that spoke of genuine care for the Henderson family's 12-year-old daughter. "Miss Sophie has been challenging for our previous staff members," Mrs. continued carefully. "She's been confined to a wheelchair for 3 years now since the accident. The doctors say there's no medical reason she can't walk, but she simply won't try anymore. She's become quite resistant to therapy, to strangers, to most forms of help, really." Grace nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. This wasn't just a housekeeping position. The Hendersons needed someone who could somehow reach their daughter, someone who could succeed where trained therapists and medical professionals had apparently failed. "What happened to her?" Grace asked gently. Mrs. hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Car accident. Mr. Henderson was driving. They were coming back from Sophie's dance recital. She was quite accomplished for her age, won several regional competitions. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head-on. Mr. Henderson walked away with minor injuries, but Sophie—" She paused, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. "Sophie hasn't been the same since. Physically, she recovered completely. Emotionally, psychologically, well, that's another matter entirely." The weight of this information settled on Grace's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She thought of her own daughter, Maya, now 25 and working as a nurse in Chicago. Grace remembered the fierce protectiveness she had felt when Maya was hurt or scared, the desperate desire to somehow absorb her child's pain and make everything better. "Mr. Henderson blames himself," Mrs. continued. "He's thrown himself into his work even more than before, if that's possible. Henderson Tech has expanded globally in the past 3 years, but I suspect it's his way of avoiding the guilt. He barely sees Sophie anymore, though whether that's because he can't bear to look at her in that wheelchair or because he simply doesn't know how to connect with her, I couldn't say." Grace was beginning to understand the true complexity of her new position. This wasn't just about cleaning rooms or organizing belongings. This was about entering a family's grief, about walking carefully through the minefield of guilt, trauma, and broken dreams that had settled over the Henderson household like a thick fog. "The therapy room," Mrs. said as they climbed the grand staircase to the second floor. "Mr. Henderson had it specially designed. Top-of-the-line equipment, everything the physical therapists recommended. Sophie used to spend hours in there working with various specialists. Now she refuses to even enter the room." They walked down a hallway lined with family portraits. Grace paused at one showing a younger Sophie, maybe 9 years old, mid-leap in what appeared to be a ballet performance. Her face was radiant with joy, her body suspended in perfect form against a backdrop of stage lights. The contrast with what Mrs. had described was heartbreaking. "She was so full of life," Mrs. said softly, noticing Grace's attention to the photograph. Dancing was everything to her. She used to practice for hours, even here at home. The whole house would fill with music, and you'd see her spinning and leaping through these halls like a little fairy. Now, the sentence hung unfinished in the air as they continued down the hallway. Grace found herself wondering what it must be like for a child who had expressed herself through movement to suddenly feel imprisoned in her own body, even when that imprisonment was more mental than physical. "Here we are," Mrs. announced as they stopped before a door painted soft lavender. Delicate silver stars had been stenciled around the frame, and a nameplate reading, "Sophie's room," hung at child height, decorated with tiny ballet slippers. Mrs. knocked gently. "Miss Sophie, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Williams. She's going to be helping us keep your room nice and tidy." "Go away." The voice from inside was muffled but clearly hostile. "I don't want to meet anyone new. I told you I don't want strangers in my room." Mrs. Face flushed slightly with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams, she's been..." Resistant to new staff. The last cleaning woman quit after Sophie threw a book at her. Grace stepped closer to the door. Something in the child's voice, beneath the anger and hostility, reminded her of a wounded animal, lashing out to protect itself from further pain. "Sophie," Grace called out gently. "My name is Grace. I'm not here to bother you or make you do anything you don't want to do. I'm just here to help keep your space clean so you can be comfortable. Would it be okay if I just introduced myself? I promise I won't stay long." There was silence from the other side of the door. Grace waited patiently, understanding that rushing would only make things worse. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened just a crack. Grace got her first glimpse of Sophie Henderson, and her heart immediately went out to the child. Where the girl in the ballet photo had been vibrant and alive, the Sophie peering through the crack in the door looked like a shadow of her former self. Her dark hair hung limp around a pale face, and her eyes, once bright with passion and joy, now held a wariness that no 12-year-old should ever possess. "Hi, Sophie," Grace said with a gentle smile. "Thank you for letting me introduce myself." Sophie's eyes studied Grace carefully, taking in everything from her kind expression to her simple, unassuming clothes. "You're different from the others," she said finally. "Different how?" "The others always look at me like I'm broken, like they feel sorry for me. You're just looking at me like I'm a person." Grace felt a flutter of hope. This child was perceptive, intelligent, and despite her defensive walls, still capable of making connections. "That's because you are a whole person, not a broken one." For the first time, Sophie opened the door a little wider. Grace could see that she was indeed in a wheelchair, a sleek, modern model that looked more like sophisticated equipment than medical apparatus. But more importantly, Grace could see the spark of intelligence and personality that still lived in Sophie's eyes, buried beneath layers of hurt and fear. "Mrs. says you're going to clean my room," Sophie said. "Only if that's okay with you. It's your space, and I want you to feel comfortable with me being here." Sophie considered this for a moment. "The last cleaning lady kept moving my things around. She said my room was too messy, but I had everything where I wanted it." "I understand completely," Grace said. "When I clean, I always try to put things back exactly where I found them, unless someone specifically asks me to organize differently. Your room should feel like your sanctuary, not like someone else arranged it." Something in Sophie's posture relaxed slightly. "Really?" "Really? In fact, maybe you could show me how you like things arranged, so I make sure I don't mess up your system." Mrs. watched this exchange with barely concealed amazement. In 5 minutes, Grace had made more progress with Sophie than most people managed in weeks. "I suppose you could come in for a minute," Sophie said, backing her wheelchair away from the door. Grace entered Sophie's room and immediately understood why the girl was so protective of her space. This wasn't just a bedroom. It was a carefully constructed refuge from a world that had become unpredictable and painful. Books were stacked in precise piles beside the bed, each stack organized by some system that made sense to Sophie. Art supplies covered a desk by the window, and half-finished drawings and paintings were pinned to a corkboard with mathematical precision. But it was the corner of the room that made Grace's heart clench. There, pushed against the far wall, was a small bar and a full-length mirror, remnants of Sophie's dancing days. Dust had begun to gather on the bar, and several ballet shoes hung from a hook on the wall like ghosts of a former life. "You don't have to look at that stuff," Sophie said quickly, noticing Grace's gaze. "I keep meaning to ask them to take it away, but..." But it's hard to let go of things that used to make us happy, Grace finished gently. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, exactly that. Grace moved carefully around the room, not touching anything, but observing how Sophie had arranged her new life within these walls. There were medical textbooks mixed in with age-appropriate novels, suggesting that Sophie had been researching her own condition. A tablet computer sat on the bedside table, probably for keeping up with schoolwork since she clearly wasn't attending regular classes. "You're an artist," Grace observed, looking at the drawings pinned to the corkboard. They were remarkably good for a 12-year-old, detailed portraits and landscapes that showed real talent and training. "I used to be a dancer," Sophie said quietly. "Now I guess I draw instead." "You're still a dancer," Grace said without thinking. "Dancing isn't just about moving your feet. It's about rhythm, about understanding how bodies move through space, about telling stories with motion. That's all still in you, whether you're in a wheelchair or not." Sophie stared at her for a long moment, and Grace worried that she had overstepped, said too much too soon. But then Sophie's expression shifted, showing the first hint of genuine interest Grace had seen. "Do you really think so?" "I know so. Movement is movement, Sophie. The form might change, but the art doesn't disappear." Mrs., who had been standing quietly in the doorway, cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Williams, perhaps we should continue the tour and let Miss Sophie have her privacy." Grace nodded, understanding that she shouldn't push too hard on this first encounter. "Thank you for letting me see your room, Sophie. I promise that when I clean in here, I'll be very careful with your things." "Grace," Sophie called as Grace reached the doorway. "Yes." Do you think you could tell me about your daughter sometime? Mrs. mentioned you have a daughter." Grace's heart swelled with unexpected emotion. This child, who had been rejecting connections with others for 3 years, was asking for a story, for a piece of Grace's life. "I would love to tell you about Maya. She's about to become a nurse, and she's the most determined person I know." "Did she ever get hurt? Did she ever feel like she couldn't do the things she used to do?" The question was loaded with meaning, and Grace understood that Sophie wasn't just making conversation. She was trying to find out if there were other people in the world who had faced setbacks and somehow found their way through. "She did get hurt once," Grace said carefully. "She broke her leg really badly when she was about your age. For a while, she thought she'd never be able to play soccer again, which broke her heart because soccer was her whole world back then." "What happened?" "Well, that's a longer story. Maybe I could tell you the whole thing tomorrow if you'd like." Sophie nodded eagerly, showing more animation than she had displayed since Grace arrived. "I'd like that." As Grace and Mrs. continued down the hallway, the older woman shook her head in amazement. "I've never seen her respond to someone like that. Most people either treat her like she's made of glass or like she's being dramatic about her situation. You spoke to her like she was." "Like she was a smart kid going through a tough time," Grace finished. "Because that's what she is." Mrs. showed Grace the rest of her responsibilities: Mr. Henderson's home office, the guest suites, the library that appeared to contain more books than some public libraries Grace had visited. But Grace's mind kept returning to Sophie, to the spark of connection she had felt, and to the enormous challenge that lay ahead. The therapy room was the last stop on the tour, and Grace understood immediately why Sophie refused to enter it. The space was technically perfect: state-of-the-art equipment, motivational posters, cheerful colors, and every accommodation a person with mobility challenges might need. But it felt cold, clinical, like a place where healing was supposed to happen according to schedule rather than a place where a young girl might rediscover her love of movement. "Mr. Henderson spares no expense," Mrs. said, gesturing toward equipment that probably cost more than Grace's car. "The best physical therapist's money can buy have worked with Sophie in this room, but she's convinced herself she can't walk, and no amount of professional encouragement seems to change her mind." Grace studied the room carefully, already beginning to form ideas about how the space might be transformed from a medical facility into something that might actually appeal to a 12-year-old girl who used to love dancing. "Has anyone ever asked Sophie what she thinks would help her?" Grace asked. Mrs. looked surprised by the question. "Well, the doctors and therapists have treatment plans based on her medical needs." "But has anyone asked Sophie herself what she thinks might work?" No, I don't think so. The assumption has been that she doesn't want to get better, that she's choosing to remain in the wheelchair." Grace nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, children usually had very good reasons for their choices, even when those reasons weren't immediately obvious to adults. Perhaps Sophie's refusal to try walking again wasn't about not wanting to get better. Perhaps it was about not wanting to fail, or not wanting to face the possibility of falling again, literally or metaphorically. The day passed quickly as Grace familiarized herself with her new responsibilities and met the rest of the household staff. But her thoughts kept returning to Sophie, to the careful way the girl had arranged her room as a fortress against disappointment, and to the hunger for connection that Grace had glimpsed beneath Sophie's defensive barriers. When Grace finally left the Henderson estate that evening, she drove home to her small apartment with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This job was going to be about more than just keeping rooms clean and organized. This was going to be about helping a family find their way back to each other, about helping a little girl remember that she was more than her limitations, and about proving that sometimes the most important healing happened through simple human connection rather than expensive equipment and professional intervention. As Grace prepared for bed that night, she found herself planning not just how she would approach her cleaning duties, but how she might slowly, carefully, begin to help Sophie see possibilities where she currently saw only barriers. The girl's question about Maya's soccer injury had been a clear signal that Sophie was looking for stories of hope, for evidence that setbacks didn't have to be permanent. Grace fell asleep that night with ballet music playing softly in her mind, already imagining how she might help Sophie remember that dancing was about joy, not just about perfect movement. And Grace arrived at the Henderson estate the next morning with a thermos of hot chocolate and a small photo album tucked in her cleaning supplies. She had spent the evening going through old pictures of Maya, selecting images that might help Sophie understand that obstacles could be overcome without minimizing the real challenges involved. Sophie was waiting by her bedroom door when Grace reached the third floor, which Mrs. Later told Grace was unprecedented. For the past 3 years, Sophie had rarely ventured out of her room before noon and never showed anticipation for any scheduled activity. "Did you bring the story about your daughter?" Sophie asked without preamble. "I did," Grace replied, settling into the comfortable reading chair that sat beside Sophie's bed. "But first I brought something else, hot chocolate, my grandmother's recipe. She used to say that serious conversations required proper refreshments." Sophie's eyes lit up at the mention of hot chocolate, the first genuinely childlike response Grace had seen from her. As Grace poured the steaming liquid into 2 cups she had brought from home, Sophie maneuvered her wheelchair closer, clearly curious about this woman who approached everything differently than the adults she was used to dealing with. "This smells amazing," Sophie said, accepting the cup with both hands. "It's not like the stuff Mrs. makes." "My grandmother was from Louisiana," Grace explained. "She had a way of making everything taste like it contained a little bit of magic. Maya used to say that Grandma's hot chocolate could cure anything from scraped knees to broken hearts." Sophie took a careful sip, and her face broke into the first genuine smile Grace had seen from her. "It does taste magical, like cinnamon and vanilla and something else I can't identify." "Love," Grace said simply. "Grandma always said that was the secret ingredient." For a few minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, sipping hot chocolate and watching the morning sun stream through Sophie's bedroom windows. Grace noticed that despite Sophie's claims of wanting to stay isolated, she had positioned her wheelchair so she could see out to the estate's gardens, where birds were beginning their daily search for food among the carefully maintained flower beds. "You said Maya got hurt playing soccer," Sophie said finally, ready to hear the story she had been waiting for. Grace opened the photo album to a picture of 12-year-old Maya in her soccer uniform, grinning widely despite a gap where she had recently lost a tooth. Maya lived and breathed soccer from the time she was 6 years old. She was fast, fearless, and absolutely convinced she was going to play professionally someday. Sophie studied the photograph carefully. "She looks happy." She was happy. Soccer was her way of expressing herself, just like dancing was yours. She practiced every day after school, played on 3 different teams, went to summer soccer camps. Her whole identity was wrapped up in being a soccer player. Grace turned to the next page, which showed Maya in a hospital bed, her leg elevated in a complicated-looking cast that extended from her hip to her ankle. The contrast with the vibrant girl in the soccer photo was stark. "What happened to her?" "She was 13 when it happened. playing in a championship game that she had been looking forward to for months. She was going for a goal when two players from the other team collided with her at the same time. Her leg broke in 3 places. Sophie winced, unconsciously touching her own legs. Did it hurt? It hurt terribly, both physically and emotionally. But the physical pain healed relatively quickly. The emotional pain took much longer. Grace turned to another photo, this one showing Maya sitting in a wheelchair much like Sophie's, staring out a window with an expression of profound sadness. She was in a wheelchair for 4 months while her bones healed. The doctors said she would walk again, but Maya didn't believe them. She was convinced that even if she could walk, she would never be fast enough to play soccer competitively again. Sophie leaned forward, clearly seeing parallels to her own situation. How did you help her? Honestly, I made a lot of mistakes at first. I tried to be encouraging, telling her everything would be fine, that she just needed to stay positive. I brought her soccer magazines and talked about her getting back on the field as soon as possible. Did that help? Grace shook her head. It made things worse. Maya felt like I didn't understand how scared she was, how much her whole sense of herself had been shaken. She needed time to grieve the loss of her old life before she could start building a new one. This clearly resonated with Sophie, who had been dealing with well-meaning adults pushing her toward recovery without acknowledging the depth of her losses. So what did work? Grace turned to a photo that showed Maya sitting at a desk, surrounded by books and papers, looking focused and engaged. I stopped trying to fix her and started listening to who she was becoming. Maya had always been smart, but soccer had taken up so much of her time that she hadn't had a chance to explore other interests. During those months in the wheelchair, she discovered that she loved learning about how the human body worked, how injuries healed, what made people resilient. She became interested in medicine. She became fascinated with the whole process of recovery, not just physical, but emotional and psychological too. She started reading everything she could find about sports medicine, about helping people overcome trauma, about the connection between mental and physical healing. Grace showed Sophie another photo, this one of Maya standing with the aid of crutches, her face showing determination rather than joy. When Maya finally started walking again, it wasn't because she wanted to get back to soccer. It was because she had found a new dream, becoming a physical therapist and eventually a nurse, so she could help other people through their recovery process. Did she ever play soccer again? She tried once she was fully healed, but she discovered that her relationship with the sport had changed. She still loved soccer, but it no longer defined who she was. She played recreationally through high school, but her real passion had shifted to helping others. Sophie was quiet for several minutes, processing this story and its implications. Grace could see the girl working through the parallels, understanding that recovery didn't necessarily mean returning to exactly the same life you had before. Maya sounds really smart, Sophie said finally. She is smart, but more than that, she's learned that being knocked down doesn't define you, how you choose to get back up does. And sometimes, getting back up means moving in a completely different direction than you originally planned. Grace pulled out the most recent photo in the album, showing Maya in her nursing school graduation gown, beaming with pride and confidence. Maya graduated last month. She's starting work next week at a rehabilitation hospital, specifically in the pediatric wing. She wants to work with kids who are learning to adapt to physical challenges. Does she think about the accident anymore? She does, but not with sadness. She says that the accident changed her life in ways she never could have imagined, mostly for the better. She learned that she was stronger than she thought, that there were parts of herself she had never explored, and that helping others heal brought her more satisfaction than any soccer game ever could. Sophie sat quietly, staring at the photo of Maya in her graduation gown. Grace could sense that the girl was wrestling with complex emotions, hope mixed with fear, curiosity tempered by protectiveness. Grace, Sophie said finally. Yes, sweetie. Do you think some people are just meant to stay broken? The question hit Grace like a physical blow, revealing the depth of Sophie's despair and self-doubt. Grace set down her cup of hot chocolate and looked directly into Sophie's eyes. Sophie, I need to tell you something very important, and I need you to really listen to me. You are not broken. You have been hurt, and you have been changed by that hurt, but you are not broken. But I can't walk. The doctors say there's nothing wrong with me, but I can't make my legs work. Maybe I'm just too weak or too scared or too. Stop, Grace said gently but firmly. Sophie, not walking right now doesn't make you weak or broken. Sometimes our bodies protect us in ways our minds don't understand. Maybe your legs aren't working because some part of you isn't ready to trust them yet. Maybe you're afraid of falling again, not just physically, but emotionally. Maybe walking feels like accepting that the accident really happened, and part of you is still fighting against that reality. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, the first tears Grace had seen from her. Everyone expects me to want to get better. But what if I try to walk and I can't do it? What if I try and I just fall down and prove that I really am broken? Grace moved from the chair to sit on the edge of Sophie's bed, bringing herself to Sophie's eye level. Then you fall down, and then you try again. Or maybe you decide that walking isn't the goal right now, and you focus on something else that makes you feel strong and capable. Like what? Grace gestured toward the art supplies on Sophie's desk. Like the beautiful drawings you create. Like the way you've organized this room to feel safe and comfortable. Like the way you're asking smart questions and making me think harder about everything I thought I knew about recovery. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Really? Really, Sophie, you are not your legs. You are your mind, your creativity, your courage, your kindness. Whether you walk or not doesn't change any of those things. For the first time since the accident, Sophie began to see herself as something other than a medical problem to be solved or a failure to be fixed. Grace could see the shift happening in real time, not a sudden cure or miraculous recovery, but a subtle change in how Sophie was thinking about herself and her possibilities. Could you tell me more about Maya's recovery? Sophie asked. Not the big things, but the little things, like what was the first thing she tried that made her feel strong again? Grace smiled, understanding that Sophie was looking for a roadmap, not for returning to her old life, but for building a new one. The first thing Maya did was learn to braid friendship bracelets. It sounds silly, but she had been so focused on using her body for sports that she had never developed fine motor skills for detailed work. Learning to create something beautiful with her hands made her feel capable in a completely new way. What else? She learned to cook. Maya had never been interested in cooking before because she was always rushing off to practice or games. But during her recovery, she started experimenting with healthy recipes, learning about nutrition and how food could support healing. She got really good at it, and it gave her a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with athletic ability. Sophie was taking mental notes, clearly thinking about activities that might help her feel competent and engaged. Did she ever get scared about trying new things? All the time. But Maya developed a rule for herself. She would try something new for 10 minutes. If she hated it after 10 minutes, she could stop and never try it again. But if she was curious or enjoying it, she would give it another 10 minutes. Most of the time, she ended up spending much longer than 10 minutes on things once she got started. 10 minutes seems manageable, Sophie said thoughtfully. Grace could see that Sophie was beginning to formulate her own approach to expanding her world beyond the safe boundaries she had created. The conversation was achieving something that months of professional therapy had not. It was helping Sophie see recovery as an exploration of new possibilities rather than a return to old limitations. They spent the rest of the morning talking about Maya's recovery process, but also about Sophie's interests and dreams. Grace learned that Sophie had always loved art, but had never had time to develop her skills because of her demanding dance schedule. She discovered that Sophie was fascinated by marine biology and had read every book in the house about ocean life. Most importantly, she realized that Sophie was hungry for intellectual challenges and creative outlets that had nothing to do with physical limitations. When it was time for Grace to begin her other duties, Sophie was reluctant to see her go. Grace, tomorrow, could you maybe show me some of the friendship bracelet patterns Maya used? I have some embroidery floss in my art supplies that I've never used. I would love to teach you to make friendship bracelets, Grace replied. And maybe you could show me some of your drawing techniques. I've always wanted to learn to sketch, but I never knew where to start. Sophie's face lit up at the suggestion that she had something valuable to offer in return. For too long, she had been positioned as someone who only received help rather than someone who could provide it. As Grace worked through her cleaning duties that afternoon, she found herself thinking about the transformation she had witnessed in Sophie over the course of just one conversation. The girl was still in a wheelchair, still struggling with complex trauma and fear, But she was no longer seeing herself as fundamentally broken. She was beginning to see herself as someone in the process of becoming, someone whose story was still being written. That evening, Grace called Maya to tell her about Sophie. Maya listened carefully to Grace's description of the girl's situation and her response to hearing about Maya's recovery. "Mom," Maya said when Grace finished the story, "it sounds like Sophie needs to know that there are different ways to be whole. When I was in that wheelchair, I thought being able-bodied was the only way to be complete. But I learned that wholeness comes from accepting all of yourself, including the parts that have been changed by difficult experiences." "I think you're right," Grace replied. "Sophie is so focused on what she can't do that she's not seeing all the things she can do. Maybe you could help her see that her wheelchair doesn't have to be a symbol of what she's lost. Maybe it could become a symbol of how she's adapting and finding new ways to move through the world." Grace went to bed that night with new ideas forming about how to help Sophie rebuild her relationship with movement and possibility. The conversation with Maya had reminded her that recovery wasn't about eliminating all signs of trauma or difficulty. It was about integrating those experiences into a life that felt meaningful and full. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Henderson estate with friends 3 weeks into Grace's employment at the Henderson estate. Sophie had made a friendship bracelet for every member of the household staff, learned to sketch realistic portraits of the birds that visited her window, and begun keeping a journal of what she called her daily discoveries, small observations about the world around her that sparked her curiosity. But it was on a rainy Thursday morning that everything began to change in ways none of them could have predicted. Grace arrived to find Sophie in her wheelchair at the bottom of the main staircase, staring up at the second floor with a look of intense frustration. Mrs. stood nearby, wringing her hands and looking helpless. "What's happening?" Grace asked, setting down her cleaning supplies and moving to Sophie's side. "My art portfolio is in the library," Sophie explained, her voice tight with disappointment. "I wanted to show you the new drawings I finished yesterday, but the elevator is broken and won't be fixed until this afternoon." Grace looked up the imposing staircase, then back at Sophie. The library was one of Sophie's favorite spaces in the house, a room where she often spent hours reading and sketching. The elevator that provided her access to the second floor was a recent addition, installed after the accident to ensure Sophie could reach all areas of the house. "I could go get your portfolio for you," Grace offered. "It's not the same," Sophie said, and Grace could hear the deeper frustration beneath her words. This wasn't really about the art portfolio. It was about independence, about the constant reminders of her limitations, about feeling trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Mrs. cleared her throat delicately. "Miss Sophie, perhaps we could wait until later to look at your drawings. The repair technician should be here soon." But Grace was studying Sophie's face, seeing something there that she hadn't noticed before. Beneath the frustration was a flicker of determination, a spark of the girl who used to dance fearlessly across stages. "Sophie," Grace said carefully, "can I ask you something that might seem strange?" Sophie nodded, curious. "Have you ever thought about what it would feel like to move up those stairs?" "I can't walk, remember?" Sophie's response was automatic, but Grace noticed that she didn't look away from the staircase. "I'm not talking about walking. I'm talking about moving. Moving your body through space, changing levels, feeling your muscles work against gravity." Mrs. looked alarmed. "Mrs. Williams, I'm not sure this is appropriate. Miss Sophie's doctors have been very clear about not pushing her." "I'm not pushing," Grace said gently. "I'm wondering, Sophie, when you watch birds outside your window, what do you notice about how they move?" Sophie looked puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "They don't just fly in straight lines. They spiral and dive and change direction. They use air currents and gravity to help them move more efficiently." "Exactly. They work with the forces around them instead of fighting against them. Sophie, what if we thought about these stairs not as a barrier, but as a different kind of dance floor?" "I don't understand." Grace moved to the bottom step and sat down, bringing herself to Sophie's eye level. "You told me that dancing was about telling stories with movement. What if there was a way to tell a story about moving up these stairs that didn't require your legs to work the way they used to?" For the first time in weeks, Grace saw genuine interest spark in Sophie's eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your arms are strong. Your core muscles work fine. You have perfect balance in your upper body. What if there was a way to dance yourself up these stairs using the parts of your body that feel confident and capable? Mrs. stepped forward, looking concerned. Mrs. Williams, this seems quite risky. Mr. Henderson would not approve of. Mrs., Sophie interrupted, her voice stronger than Grace had ever heard it. Could you please give Grace and me some privacy to talk about this? The older woman looked torn between her protective instincts and her growing recognition that Sophie was showing more engagement and autonomy than she had in years. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything. Please be careful, Miss Sophie. After Mrs. left, Sophie wheeled closer to the staircase, studying it with new eyes. You really think there's a way to get up there without walking? Sophie, I've watched you maneuver that wheelchair for 3 weeks. You have incredible upper body strength and spatial awareness. You've taught yourself to navigate narrow spaces, to turn corners smoothly, to control your speed and direction perfectly. Those are all skills that dancers use. Sophie was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through possibilities. Grace could see her mental gears turning, the analytical mind that had been dormant for too long beginning to engage with a physical challenge. It would be like choreographing a routine, Sophie said finally. Exactly like choreographing a routine. You would be creating a sequence of movements that would get you from point A to point B, using the tools and abilities you have right now. But what if I get stuck partway up? What if I can't do it and just end up looking stupid? Grace stood and moved to the 3rd step, then sat down again. Then I'll be right here with you. We'll figure out each movement together, one step at a time, and if at any point you want to stop, we stop. No pressure, no judgment. Sophie stared at the staircase for another long moment, then turned to Grace with a look of determination that reminded Grace powerfully of the young dancer in the family photographs. How would we start? Grace felt a surge of excitement but kept her voice calm and matter-of-fact. We start by studying the problem. What's the height of each step? How much space is there to maneuver? What positions would give you the best leverage and balance? Sophie wheeled closer to the stairs and began examining them with the focused attention she usually reserved for her art projects. She ran her hands along testing its height and stability. She measured the depth of each step with her eyes, clearly calculating angles and distances. "These is the right height for me to grip securely," she observed, "and these steps are deep enough that I would have room to position myself safely." "What else do you notice?" "The carpet provides good traction. The extends all the way to the top, so I would have support for the entire journey." Sophie paused, then looked at Grace with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I think I can see a way to do this." "Tell me what you're thinking." Sophie took a deep breath, clearly organizing her thoughts. "I would position my wheelchair at an angle next to the bottom step. Then I would transfer from the chair to sit on the step itself, using the for support. Once I was seated on the step, I could use my arms and core muscles to lift myself to the next step, and then the next." Grace nodded encouragingly. "That sounds like a solid plan. Have you ever transferred from your chair to other surfaces?" "I transfer to my bed every night and to the couch in the living room. I'm actually pretty good at it." "Then you already have the basic skills you need. This would just be applying those skills in a new environment." Sophie wheeled even closer to the stairs, positioning her chair exactly as she had described. "Grace, would you spot me, just to make sure I don't fall?" Grace's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, I'll be right beside you the whole time." Sophie locked the wheels of her chair and gripped them with her right hand. With her left hand braced on her armrest, she slowly shifted her weight forward, testing her balance and the reliability of her support points. "How does that feel?" Grace asked. "Scary, but also," Sophie paused, searching for words. "Also kind of exciting. I haven't felt this engaged with movement in 3 years." "That's because this is your idea, your plan, your choice. You're not being pushed to do something you're not ready for. You're choosing to explore something that interests you." Sophie continued her careful preparation, adjusting her position until she felt confident about the transfer. Grace positioned herself on the step above, ready to provide support if needed, but trying not to hover in a way that would make Sophie feel incompetent. "Okay," Sophie said, taking a deep breath. "I'm going to try the transfer." With fluid, controlled movement, Sophie lifted herself from her wheelchair and settled onto the bottom step of the staircase. For a moment, she just sat there, looking amazed at what she had accomplished. I'm on the stairs, she said, her voice filled with wonder. I'm actually sitting on the stairs. How does it feel? Sophie was quiet for a moment, clearly taking inventory of her physical and emotional responses. It feels higher than I expected. I can see the second floor from here. And Grace. Yes. My legs are tingling, not in a bad way, but like they're aware of where they are. Grace felt a surge of hope, but tried to keep her response measured. That's interesting. How do you feel about trying to move to the next step? Sophie gripped the more tightly and assessed the step above her. I think I can do it. The angle looks manageable. Using primarily her arm strength and core stability, Sophie carefully maneuvered herself up to the second step, then the third. With each successful transition, her confidence grew and her movements became more fluid. Sophie, Grace said as they reached the fifth step, you're developing a completely new form of movement. This isn't walking, but it isn't just sitting either. You're creating something uniquely your own. Sophie paused to rest, but Grace could see that she was energized rather than exhausted. It does feel like dancing, like I'm working with gravity and momentum instead of fighting against them. They continued up the staircase slowly, taking breaks when Sophie needed to rest or readjust her position. Grace provided encouragement and practical support, but it was clear that Sophie was the one leading this expedition. When they reached the halfway point, Sophie suddenly stopped moving and sat very still on the step. What's wrong? Grace asked, concerned. Nothing's wrong, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace, I can feel my legs, not just tingling but really feel them, like they're connected to the rest of my body again. Grace sat down beside Sophie, understanding the magnitude of what was happening. How long has it been since you felt that connection? Since the accident, since that night in the hospital when I woke up and couldn't make them move. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. I thought that feeling was gone forever. Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to come back. Maybe it needed you to be ready to trust your body again. They sat together on the stairs for several minutes, both understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Sophie wasn't just climbing stairs, she was reclaiming her relationship with movement, with challenge, with her own physical capabilities. Do you want to continue to the top? Grace asked. Sophie nodded, but then hesitated. Grace, what if this is just a one-time thing? What if tomorrow I can't feel my legs again? Then tomorrow we'll work with whatever you can feel. Sophie, this isn't about proving that you're cured or that everything is back to normal. This is about proving that you're capable of more than you thought, that your body is still yours to work with, even if it works differently than it used to. With renewed determination, Sophie continued her ascent. By the time they reached the top of the staircase, she was glowing with accomplishment and exhaustion. I did it, she said, looking back down the stairs with amazement. I actually did it. You absolutely did, and Sophie. Yes. You didn't just climb those stairs. You danced up them. You created a new form of movement that honored both your limitations and your capabilities. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing the full significance of what had just occurred. Grace, do you think? Do you think there might be other things I can do that I haven't tried? Other ways to move and explore and challenge myself? Grace smiled, seeing in Sophie's face the return of curiosity and hope that had been missing for so long. I think you're just getting started discovering what you're capable of. As they made their way to the library to retrieve Sophie's art portfolio, a journey that now felt victorious rather than impossible, Grace realized that they had accomplished something far more important than reaching the second floor. They had proven to Sophie that her story was still being written, that limitations could be starting points for creativity rather than ending points for possibility. When they finally returned to the first floor, Sophie choosing to navigate the descent step by step rather than using the now repaired elevator, Mrs. was waiting with an expression of amazed concern. Miss Sophie, what on earth? How did you? Sophie's response was radiant with confidence. I danced up the stairs, Mrs., and tomorrow, Grace is going to help me figure out what other kinds of dancing I can do. Hip bracelet supplies, and the sound of voices and movement coming from the therapy room was so unexpected that Mrs. had to pause outside the door to make sure she wasn't imagining things. For the past month, since Sophie's successful stair-climbing adventure, the room that had sat empty for 3 years had become the center of daily activity. Inside, Grace and Sophie had completely transformed the clinical space into something that felt more like a dance studio than a medical facility. The motivational posters had been replaced with Sophie's artwork, drawings of dancers, birds in flight, and abstract representations of movement and flow. The sterile equipment had been pushed to one side, making room for yoga mats, resistance bands, and a portable sound system that currently filled the room with soft classical music. "Remember," Grace was saying as she demonstrated a movement from her position on the floor, "this isn't about making your legs work the way they used to. This is about discovering all the ways your body can express itself." Sophie, seated on a mat with her legs stretched out in front of her, was working through a series of upper body movements that flowed together like a seated dance routine. Her face showed the focused concentration Grace remembered from watching professional dancers. But there was something else there too, joy. "I can feel the music in my shoulders and arms," Sophie said, moving through a graceful port bras that would have been at home in any ballet studio. "It's like my whole upper body is dancing even if my legs are just there." "Your legs aren't just there," Grace corrected gently. "Look at how you're using them for balance, how they're providing a foundation for all your upper body movement. They're participating, just in a different way than before." Mrs. knocked softly before entering the room. Both Grace and Sophie looked up, their faces flushed with exertion and happiness. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Mrs. said, "but Miss Sophie, your father is here. He's asking to see you." The change in Sophie's expression was immediate and dramatic. The joy and confidence that had been building over the past weeks seemed to drain away, replaced by the guarded wariness that had characterized her behavior for years. "Dad's here, but it's Thursday afternoon. He's never here on Thursday afternoons." Grace had heard about Mr. Henderson from the household staff, but in the 6 weeks she had been working at the estate, she had barely seen him. He left for work before dawn and returned long after Sophie was asleep, communicating with his daughter primarily through Mrs. and the tutors who provided Sophie's homeschooling. "He's in the main living room," Mrs. continued. "He seems different today, more present if that makes sense." Sophie looked to Grace with an expression that clearly asked for support. Grace nodded and began helping Sophie transfer back to her wheelchair, but Sophie surprised both women by shaking her head. "No," Sophie said firmly, "I want to walk to meet him." Mrs. eyebrows shot up. "Miss Sophie, you haven't." "I know I haven't, but I want to try. Grace, will you help me?" Over the past month, Sophie had been experimenting with brief periods of supported standing, using the parallel bars that were part of the therapy room equipment. She had progressed to taking a few shuffling steps while holding onto the bars, more as an exploration of balance and coordination than as a serious attempt at walking. But this was different. This was Sophie choosing to meet her father on her feet, choosing to show him that she was more than the broken girl he had been avoiding. "Are you sure?" Grace asked. "There's no pressure to prove anything to anyone." "I'm sure, but I'm also scared. What if I can't do it? What if I try to walk and just fall down in front of him?" Grace moved to face Sophie directly. "Then you fall down, and then you get back up, or you don't, and either way you'll have tried something brave. Sophie, you don't have to walk to show your father that you're strong. You've already proven your strength in a dozen different ways." "I know, but I want to. I want him to see that I'm not the same scared girl who gave up trying 3 years ago." With Grace's support, Sophie transferred from the mat to a standing position at the parallel bars. Her legs shook slightly from the unfamiliar weight, but she held the position with determination. "How does that feel?" Grace asked. "Wobbly but not impossible." Sophie took a tentative step forward, then another. "Grace, they're working. My legs are actually working." Mrs. watched in amazement as Sophie slowly made her way down the length of the parallel bars, her movements careful but increasingly confident. "Miss Sophie, this is remarkable. How long have you been practicing this?" "We've been working on different kinds of movement for weeks," Sophie explained, pausing to rest but maintaining her standing position. "Grace helped me understand that walking doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful." Grace moved to Sophie's side, ready to provide support if needed. "Sophie, walking down to meet your father is a big step, literally and figuratively. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" Sophie considered this carefully. "I think I'm ready to try, but Grace, would you come with me? I don't want to face him alone." "Of course I'll come with you." The journey from the therapy room to the main living room took 20 minutes. Sophie moved slowly, using the wall for support and taking frequent rest breaks. Grace stayed close beside her, offering encouragement but letting Sophie set the pace and make the decisions about when to continue. When they reached the top of the main staircase, Sophie paused and looked down at her father, who was sitting in an armchair reading what appeared to be a business report. "He looks older," Sophie observed quietly. Grace studied David Henderson from their vantage point on the second floor. Mrs. was right. There was something different about him today. The usual sharp focus and aggressive energy that characterized his brief appearances seemed subdued, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion or resignation. "People change when they're carrying guilt and sadness," Grace said gently. "Your father has been hurting too, Sophie. Maybe not in the same way you have, but he's been hurting." "I know, but for 3 years he's barely looked at me. What if he still can't stand to see me?" "Then that's his loss, not yours. Sophie, you've spent 3 years becoming an incredible young woman, artistic, thoughtful, brave, resilient. If your father can't see that, it doesn't change who you are." Sophie nodded, drawing strength from Grace's words. "Okay, let's go down." The descent down the main staircase was different from Sophie's climbing adventure weeks earlier. This time, Sophie chose to walk down the stairs step by step, using them for support but moving primarily under her own power. David Henderson looked up from his papers when he heard footsteps on the staircase. The expression on his face went through a rapid succession of emotions: surprise, disbelief, hope, and something that might have been fear. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Dad," Sophie replied, continuing her careful descent. "I wanted to come down and see you." David Henderson stood up abruptly, his business papers scattering to the floor. Grace could see that he was struggling with the urge to rush to Sophie's aid and the recognition that she was accomplishing something important on her own. You're walking," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "I'm walking," Sophie confirmed, reaching the bottom of the staircase and taking a few steps into the living room. "It's not perfect and it's not fast, but I'm walking." Father and daughter stood looking at each other across the elegant living room, both seeming uncertain about how to bridge the gap that had grown between them over 3 years of mutual avoidance and unspoken guilt. "How?" David asked finally. Sophie looked back at Grace, who had remained discreetly in the background. "Grace helped me remember that I'm stronger than I thought I was. She helped me understand that being different doesn't mean being broken." David's eyes moved to Grace for the first time, really seeing her as more than just household staff. "Mrs. Williams, Grace has been teaching me new ways to move, new ways to think about my body and what it can do," Sophie continued. "She's been helping me remember what it feels like to challenge myself and try new things." "The doctors said," David began, then stopped, clearly struggling to process what he was witnessing. "The doctors said there was no medical reason I couldn't walk," Sophie finished. "They were right, but they didn't understand that the reason wasn't medical, it was emotional. I was too scared to try because I was afraid of disappointing everyone again." David's face crumpled, and Grace realized that Sophie had unknowingly hit on the core of his own guilt and fear. "Sophie, you never disappointed anyone. The accident wasn't your fault, and not being able to walk wasn't your fault either." "I know that now, but for 3 years I felt like I had failed somehow, like I had let everyone down by not getting better faster." Father and daughter moved closer to each other, the physical distance between them shrinking as they began to address the emotional distance that had kept them apart. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. I should have been here for you. I should have been helping you through this instead of hiding in my work." "Why did you stay away, Dad? Did you blame me for the accident?" David's response came out in a rush of emotion that had been building for years. "I blamed myself. Every time I looked at you in that wheelchair, I remembered that I was the one driving that night. I was the one who didn't see the other car soon enough. I was the one who couldn't protect you." Sophie moved closer to her father, her steps more confident now that she was focused on reaching him. "Dad, the accident wasn't your fault either. You didn't choose for that drunk driver to run the red light. You didn't choose for any of this to happen." When Sophie was close enough, David reached out tentatively, as if he wasn't sure he deserved to touch his daughter. Sophie closed the remaining distance between them and let her father wrap her in a hug that spoke of 3 years of missed connections and unspoken love. Grace watched from across the room, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the beginning of healing that went far beyond Sophie's physical recovery. This family had been broken by tragedy and trauma, but they were slowly finding their way back to each other. "I've missed you so much," David whispered into Sophie's hair. "I've missed knowing who you're becoming, missed being part of your life." "I've missed you too, Dad, but we don't have to miss any more of each other if we don't want to." They held each other for several minutes, both crying and both beginning to release the guilt and fear that had kept them apart. When they finally separated, David looked at Grace with an expression of profound gratitude. "Mrs. Williams, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my daughter." Grace shook her head. "I didn't do anything except believe in Sophie and give her space to rediscover her own strength. She did all the hard work of healing." "But you saw something in her that the rest of us missed," David insisted. "You saw potential where we saw problems." Sophie moved to stand beside Grace, her hand resting on Grace's arm in a gesture of support and affection. "Grace helped me understand that recovery doesn't mean going back to exactly who I was before. It means becoming who I'm meant to be now." David looked at his daughter with new eyes, seeing not the victim of a tragedy, but a young woman who had developed wisdom and resilience through her struggles. "Who are you becoming, Sophie?" Sophie's answer was confident and clear. "I'm becoming someone who knows that strength comes in many forms, that limitations can be starting points for creativity, and that the most important kind of walking is moving forward in your life, whether that happens on legs or wheels or any other way." David smiled through his tears, recognizing glimpses of the determined little girl who used to practice ballet routines in the hallway, but seeing also the depth and maturity that had grown from facing real challenges. "I want to be part of your recovery," he said. "I want to learn about these new ways of moving and thinking that Grace has been teaching you. I want to know who you're becoming." "I'd like that, Dad, but I need you to understand that recovery isn't about getting back to where I was before the accident. It's about moving forward from where I am now." "I understand, and Sophie." "Yes. I'm proud of you. Not because you're walking again, but because you never gave up on yourself, even when it seemed like everyone else had given up on you." Sophie looked back at Grace, her expression filled with gratitude and love. "I didn't do it alone. Grace showed me that asking for help isn't giving up, it's being smart enough to accept support when you need it." As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room windows, illuminating this family that was slowly learning to hope again, Grace realized that her role in Sophie's life was entering a new phase. She had helped Sophie remember her strength and reconnect with her father, but the real work of rebuilding their relationship and continuing Sophie's recovery would belong to them. The little girl who had thrown books at strangers and refused to leave her room had become a young woman who could walk downstairs to meet challenges head-on. And the father who had hidden from his guilt and pain was beginning to step forward into the possibility of healing and connection. 6 months after that pivotal afternoon in the living room, the Henderson estate had transformed into something none of them could have imagined. The therapy room had evolved into a movement studio, where Sophie spent hours each day exploring new forms of dance that incorporated her wheelchair as a partner rather than a limitation. The library had been expanded to include a section on adaptive sports and therapeutic arts. Most significantly, David Henderson had rearranged his entire schedule to be present for his daughter's daily life. Grace was in the kitchen preparing her famous hot chocolate when she heard familiar voices coming from the garden. Through the window, she could see David and Sophie working together in what had once been a formal flower bed and was now a therapeutic garden designed for accessibility and hands-on learning. "Dad, I think the tomatoes need more water," Sophie was saying, maneuvering her wheelchair between raised garden beds that had been specially constructed at the perfect height for her to tend plants independently. "You're probably right," David replied, kneeling beside one of the beds to check the soil moisture. "You've gotten much better at reading what the plants need than I have." This scene would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. David Henderson, who had once worked 16-hour days and taken business calls during family dinners, now blocked out every afternoon to spend time with Sophie. The garden had been his idea, a suggestion that growing things together might help them grow closer to each other. Grace smiled as she watched them work side by side, both of them wearing old clothes and sporting dirt under their fingernails. Sophie's wheelchair had been fitted with specialized gardening attachments, and she moved through the beds with the same grace and precision she brought to all her movements now. The sound of the doorbell interrupted Grace's observation. Mrs. appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking slightly flustered. "Mrs. Williams, there's someone here to see you. A young woman who says she's your daughter." Grace's heart leaped with excitement. Maya had driven up from Chicago to spend her first free weekend since starting her new job at the rehabilitation hospital. Grace had told her so much about Sophie and David that Maya had asked if she could meet them during her visit. "That's Maya," Grace explained to Mrs. "I hope it's all right that she's here. Mr. Henderson said it would be fine for her to visit." Of course, she's lovely. I put her in the main sitting room." Grace found Maya standing by the large windows that overlooked the garden, watching David and Sophie with obvious interest. Maya had grown into a confident young woman whose nursing training had given her a special appreciation for different types of recovery and healing. "Mom," Maya said, embracing Grace warmly, "they look happy out there." "They've come such a long way," Grace replied, "both of them." "Tell me about Sophie's progress. In your letters, you mentioned that she's walking more consistently now." Grace nodded, her pride in Sophie evident. "She walks every day now, sometimes for hours. But more importantly, she's redefined what recovery means for her. She uses her wheelchair when it serves her purposes and walks when that feels right. She stopped seeing it as an either-or choice." "That's huge. At the hospital, we see so many kids who get stuck thinking that there's only one right way to be whole." Through the window, they watched as Sophie demonstrated something to her father, moving from her wheelchair to a standing position to reach a higher shelf in the potting shed, then settling back into her chair with fluid confidence. "She makes it look so natural now," Maya observed. "Because for her, it is natural. Sophie has learned to work with her body as it is, not as she wishes it were. She's probably in better physical condition now than she was before the accident and definitely more mentally resilient." David looked up from the garden and noticed Grace and Maya at the window. He said something to Sophie, who immediately brightened and began wheeling toward the house. "They want to meet you," Grace told Maya. "Sophie has been excited about this visit for weeks." Father and daughter came through the garden doors together, both of them glowing with the kind of health that comes from spending time outdoors and enjoying each other's company. "You must be Maya," David said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Grace talks about you constantly. Thank you for sharing your mother with us. She's changed our lives in ways I'm still trying to understand." Maya shook his hand, immediately liking his straightforward manner. "Thank you for recognizing what a special person my mom is. She's been helping people discover their strength my whole life." Sophie wheeled closer, and Grace could see that she was nervous about making a good impression on the daughter of the woman who had become so important to her. "Hi, Maya," Sophie said shyly. "Grace showed me pictures of you in your nursing uniform. You look really professional and confident." "Thank you, Sophie, and you look exactly like the amazing artist and dancer Grace has been telling me about. She showed me photos of some of your recent paintings. They're incredible." Sophie's face lit up with pleasure. Grace had learned that one of the most important parts of Sophie's recovery was having her accomplishments recognized and celebrated, particularly by people whose opinions mattered to her. "Would you like to see my studio?" Sophie asked. "Grace helped me set it up so I can paint and draw and work on movement exercises all in the same space." "I would love to see your studio." As they made their way through the house, David fell into step beside Grace. "Maya seems wonderful. You should be very proud." "I am proud, but I'm also grateful for the way this family has welcomed both of us. Sophie has been as much of a gift to me as I hope I've been to her." "Grace, I need you to know that what you've done for Sophie, for both of us, goes far beyond anything we could ever repay. You didn't just help my daughter learn to walk again. You helped us learn to be a family again." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, as she often did when David or Sophie expressed their gratitude. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Henderson. Watching Sophie discover her strength and seeing you two reconnect has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." They reached Sophie's studio, which had indeed been transformed into an inspiring workspace that accommodated all of Sophie's interests and needs. Easels were positioned at wheelchair height, art supplies were organized in accessible storage, and a sound system filled the room with soft music that Sophie used for her movement practices. "This is amazing," Maya said, genuinely impressed by the thoughtful design. "You've created a space that really supports your creativity." Sophie beamed with pride. "Grace helped me think through what I needed to feel comfortable and inspired, and Dad helped me understand that having accommodations doesn't mean settling for less. It means designing my environment to bring out my best work." Maya moved around the room, examining Sophie's artwork with the eye of someone who understood the connection between physical and emotional healing. The paintings showed a progression from dark, angular works created in the early days after Grace's arrival to vibrant, flowing pieces that celebrated movement and possibility. "Sophie, these recent paintings are extraordinary. You can see such joy and energy in the brushstrokes." "I started painting movement instead of stillness," Sophie explained. "Grace helped me understand that art could be another way of dancing, another way of expressing the rhythms and flows that I love." David watched his daughter explain her artistic process, his face showing the wonder of a parent who was still discovering who his child had become. "Sophie has taught me so much about resilience and creativity. She's shown me that sometimes the most beautiful art comes from learning to work within limitations rather than pretending they don't exist." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "At the hospital, we see that principle all the time. The patients who do best are often the ones who find ways to make their new circumstances work for them rather than fighting against reality." "Exactly," Sophie said excitedly. "Grace taught me that my wheelchair could be a dance partner, that my different way of moving could be just as valid and beautiful as traditional walking. Once I stopped trying to be exactly who I was before the accident, I could start becoming who I was meant to be after the accident." They spent the afternoon together, with Sophie showing Maya her various projects and Maya sharing stories from the rehabilitation hospital that resonated with Sophie's own experiences. Grace and David found themselves talking about the changes they had witnessed in Sophie and in their family dynamic. "The transformation has been remarkable," David said as they watched Sophie and Maya working together on a painting that incorporated both their styles. "But I think the most important change is that Sophie no longer sees herself as someone recovering from damage. She sees herself as someone developing new capabilities." "That shift in perspective makes all the difference," Grace agreed. "Once Sophie stopped measuring herself against who she used to be and started exploring who she could become, everything opened up for her." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Maya and Sophie had become fast friends, bonded by their shared understanding of how challenges could become catalysts for growth. David had relaxed into the role of proud father, no longer burdened by guilt about the accident, but focused on supporting Sophie's continued development. When it was time for Maya to leave, Sophie surprised everyone by standing up from her wheelchair to hug Maya goodbye. "Thank you for sharing your story with me," Sophie said. "Knowing that your leg injury led you to nursing helps me believe that maybe my accident will lead me to something meaningful too." "I'm sure it will," Maya replied. "You're already making meaning from your experiences through your art and your advocacy for adaptive movement. That's going to inspire other kids who are facing similar challenges." After Maya left, David, Sophie, and Grace sat together in the garden as the sun set over the estate. It had become their daily ritual, a time to reflect on the day and connect with each other without the distractions of work or therapy or outside obligations. "Grace," Sophie said, her voice soft in the gathering twilight, "I want to ask you something, but I don't want you to feel like you have to say yes." Grace looked at Sophie with curiosity and affection. "What is it, sweetie?" "I've been thinking about starting a program to help other kids who are dealing with physical challenges. Not therapy exactly, but more like what you did with me, helping them see possibilities instead of just limitations." David leaned forward, clearly interested in his daughter's idea. "Tell us more about what you're thinking." "I want to create a space where kids can explore movement and art and gardening and all kinds of activities that help them feel capable and creative. I want to show them that there are many ways to be whole, many ways to be strong." Grace felt her heart swell with pride and amazement. Sophie had traveled from a girl who refused to leave her room to a young woman who wanted to help others discover their own strength. Grace understood that some of the most important healing happened not in therapy rooms or hospitals, but in moments of simple human connection, when people choose to see potential rather than problems, and to offer hope rather than judgment. Sense of mission. She had realized that her role in Sophie's life wasn't to be her therapist or her doctor. It was to be her friend, her advocate, and her reminder that healing could happen in ways that no one had yet imagined. Sometimes the most beautiful performances came from learning to move in new ways rather than trying to recreate old ones.